railway that put Attanagh on the map, giving it that all-important dot that denoted railway station. But the dot on its own meant nothing unless it was linked to all the other dots that formed the railway network. So we must look at the history of that network to see where Attanagh fits into it. The first passenger-carrying railway was in England, the Stockton and Darlington in 1824. 10 years later, Ireland got its first railway from Dublin to Kingstown, now Dunleary. By the mid-1850s, railways had radiated out from Dublin to almost all the principal cities in Ireland, and in the next 30 years, the tracks had reached some of the most remote parts of the country. The railway reached Kilkenny from Dublin via Carlow in 1848, the same year that the Dublin to Cork railway got to Marlborough, now Cork. 3 years later, the railway reached Waterford. Business and commercial interests in that city soon realised the potential the railway had to develop the trade and exports, so proposals took root to link the centre of Ireland with the port of Waterford. In 1860, a company called the Kilkenny Junction Railway started to construct a railway north from Kilkenny City, and by the summer of 1864, it had reached Abbeyleix. A train service between these two places was inaugurated, but it was suspended after 3 months because Abbeyleix was too small a town for a railway terminus. During the time that that service operated, there was no railway station in Attanagh. The railway company had proposed putting in a station in Closhon to be called Durrow and Balnahill, but there was strong opposition to this, and demands were made that the station be in Attanagh. There was little difficulty in getting this because the company had their own plans to put in a junction in Attanagh with a line going to Durrow, Rathdowney, Burleson, Osric, Osprey and even further afield. And despite considerable planning being carried out on the route, it eventually came to nothing. When the line was built to Marlborough in 1867, train services recommenced, and on the first day of May of that year, Attanagh got its railway station. The first train calling that morning at 20 minutes to 7. From that day and for the next 95 years and 7 months, Attanagh was a dot on the railway map of Ireland. The Kilkenny Junction Railway only built the line. The operation of it was taken over by another company called the Waterford and Centre of Ireland Railway. This continued until 1900, when the GSWR, or Great Southern and Western Railway, took it over, and in 1925 this changed to the GSR, the Great Southern Railway, which lasted to the nationalisation of the railways in 1944, when it became Chorus Umper Air. From early days down to the Second World War years, 3 passenger trains ran in each direction on weekdays, with 1 in each direction on Sundays. From the late 1940s, this was reduced to 4 trains per weekday, with no regular Sunday service. At least 1 goods train in each direction operated on weekdays. People used the passenger trains to do shopping and business in the towns served by the railway, particularly Kilkenny and Abbeyleix, and it was of course possible to travel to Dublin and back the same day. But it was the excursion trains that introduced most of the ordinary people to the railways. These were a feature from the very beginning. Cheap day return tickets were issued for these special trains, which in early times ran mainly to race meetings and the seaside. From the early 1870s to the late 1930s, an excursion train ran to Tramore on Sundays in the summertime between June and August. This train called at Attanagh just before 9 in the morning and was back about 12 hours later. The fare of 3 shillings, 15 cents, might now look paltry, but 100 years ago, for many, this was half a week's wages. Many people, young and old, rich and poor, availed of this service. Without it, they would never have got a chance to get to the seaside or have a decent day out. The trip to Tramore was, of course, a bit of an adventure, because the train that joined in Attanagh only took them to the main railway station at Waterford Bridge. It was then necessary to walk almost a mile across the city to Manor Street to get the Waterford Tramore train, which usually took over 20 minutes to do the 7.5 miles to Tramore. In the evening, care had to be taken to leave Tramore in time to catch the train home in Waterford. By far the most people who used the excursion trains were those who travelled to GAA games. In early days, the railway boards were opposed to these games and refused to provide trains for them, but when they found there was money to be made this way, they quickly changed their minds. For a considerable time, the trains were chartered by the GA county boards, and this led to the irregular situation as trains to matches in which Kilkenny played did not call at Attanagh. This changed at the end of the 1920s, when trains were run directly by the railway company. Many diverse events and venues were served by the excursion trains, from the famous Eucharistic Congress in Dublin in June 1932 to pioneer rallies and pilgrimages to Knock Shrine in County Mayo. It was not completely one-way traffic either. Excursions also ran to Attanagh. The Attanagh races were always served by special trains, and similar services were laid on for cricket matches in Durrow. The last ever excursion was an unusual one in October 1962 to Kilkenny for Chipperfield Circus. The station did have its moments, good and bad, over the years. The autumn day in 1884, when the uncrowned King of Ireland, Charles Stuart Parnell, addressed a waiting crowd from a carriage window, and 20 years later a crowned head, King Edward VII and his Queen Alexandria, passed this way on their royal visit to the Marquess of Ormond in Kilkenny. The waiting loyalist supporter scarcely got a glimpse of the King, and he about only returned the glimpse. But at least it gave the signalman Jim Foley the right to boast for the rest of his life that he gave the staff to the Royal Train. In March 1923, the politics of the Civil War were said to have been behind the unsavoury incident in which the station house and goods store were burned down. By far the greatest activity of the station centred on its goods traffic. Even though only 2 goods trains per day generally operated, the down goods coming just after midday and the up goods in the afternoon, the general run of goods items handled were the Durrow sundries, that is various supplies for the Durrow shopkeepers. Durrow mills in their days generated a lot of grain traffic, and a considerable amount of timber was loaded from the woods around. The brickyard in its time had its own siding for loading and unloading its produce and requirements. But it was the introduction of the sugar beet industry in the 1920s that brought the station its greatest activity. The beet loading campaign, they called it, started around the last week of October and went on to the first week of January. Campaigns are normally associated with wars and battles, and for the farmers it was a series of battles with the weather, the sugar company and the railway, all of which had to be won if the beet was to get to the sugar factory and the farmer to get his hard-earned check. From the beginning of the sugar industry, a new figure made his appearance on the farming scene, the beet agent, or as he was more often called, the loading agent. He was an important man, the man in the middle, the go-between the farmer, the sugar company and the railway. His involvement was, of course, year-round, from getting the contract signed in the spring to summer inspection, but it was in the vital arrangements for the dispatch of the beet to the sugar factory that the agent came into his own. The loading order was issued for a particular day during the campaign, and hail, rain or snow, the farmer had to load his wagon of beet that day. This was a most laborious task. The beet had to be carted from the fields to the roadside, reloaded into carts, brought to the station, and then sprung into railway wagons. This wagon conveyed 8, 10 or 12 tons. A good acre of beet would produce more than a wagon could carry, so there had to be a final day when the farmer got away the last of his beet. For those whose farms were some distance from the station, lorries were used to bring in the beet to the railway wagons. Loading and unloading these lorries in all weathers was also heavy work. The considerable administrative work behind the scenes in organising the supply of beet to the sugar factory, cooperating with the railway for its transport, fell on the loading agent. Being on the right side of the agent was all important for the farmer. If he had several acres of beet, getting loading orders according as he had the beet crop ready to go to the factory was of immense help, because the agent was the man in charge. The loaded wagons of beet were taken to the factory by special train, the Beet Special they called it. This train came at night around 9 o'clock, and because Attanagh was the last station in the Carlow factory area, it went no farther up the line. The engine came bunker first, pulling the empty wagons and guards' van behind it. In pitch dark, in all weathers, a complex shunting operation that would give modern-day health and safety officials the bends took place, picking up the loaded wagons and leaving the empties for the next day's labours. The railway also brought wagon loads of beet pulp, a byproduct of the sugar industry used for feeding animals. The beet manure came in early spring and the station became quite busy for a week or so while the farmers collected their 100-weight bags of beet compound, and later on the beet seed came. The last ever wagon of beet in Attanagh was loaded by Jack Holican of Earl's Garden on Saturday the 29th of December 1962. The loading facilities at Attanagh left a lot to be desired and were a constant issue over the years. The loading platform, or bank as it was called, could only accommodate 5 wagons. It was only in later times that it had a part concrete floor. There was no shelter and no lighting, and on account of the position of the bank, loading had to stop while goods trains were shunting, thus reducing the farmers' time on a short winter's day. These problems were the subject of much debate in a time that is now long past, and continued right to the end of the railway. Someone said recently that there's no such thing as railways now, and to a certain degree they're correct. I know that there is services like the Dart and the Luce and the Intercity and the Minute Commuter Service and a few others, but these trains are nothing better than strings of gaudily painted buses on tracks, serving monotonously similar stations, with their concrete platform and a yellow line on them, and a flimsy shelter. The ticket vending machine is a poor substitute for the punctual station master or self-important booking clerk. Because the railways of today is a soulless thing, without an atmosphere or culture or a fascination for anyone. No young lad now would want to drive a train, he'd rather drive the family car. That's not the sort of railway we knew in Attanagh 50 years ago. The railway we knew developed in Victorian times, reached its zenith in the Edwardian era and went into decline in the first half of the 20th century. The railway company was a power of its own, a law unto itself, with hundreds of laws and bylaws, rules and regulations. There were layers of officials, down through which the chain of command filtered almost military style. From the hard-hatted suited gents who sat around the boardroom table to the weathered and bronze plate layers and milesmen who kept the permanent way train-worthy in all winds and weathers. In between there were managers, superintendents, engineers, a whole rake of inspectors, down to the local official face of the company, the station master. Though now an extinct species, the station master was in the past an important figure. Whether he lorded it over a busy city terminus with hundreds of staff and thousands of passengers, or whether he was bored alone at a remote rural flagstop where his main duty was opening and closing the level crossing gates, the station master, like the captain on a ship, was master of all he surveyed. He ensured that his subordinates carried out all their duties meticulously, and that his station was kept to the highest possible standard. A man of standing in the community, in the towns and villages strung out along the lines, the station master in the local social pecking order came close on the heels of the schoolmaster or the Garda sergeant, because he carried that air of authority about him. Much lower in rank than the station master, but perhaps a little more in the public eye, was the platform porter. With his shiny peaked cap and brightly buttoned uniform, the porter could be jack of all trades about the station, but he mainly pushed his truck car or pulled his trolley of luggage and parcels to and from the trains. He was polite and courteous to the passengers, but he made sure that he paid special attention to the first-class passengers, opening and closing the carriage door and inquiring if Madam would care to sit in this seat, or perhaps Madam would prefer to sit with her back to the engine. If Madam had much luggage, she was assured that it was safely deposited in the guard's van. Much appreciated, ma'am, thank you very much. The tip was very important, because a porter's pay could be modest enough. Then there was the guard with his green flag or lamp at night, without whose wave the train could not start on its journey. But it was the men in front, the footplate crew as they were always called, who really caught the eye. The black-faced fireman who waved at every child and every farmer on his route, and the stern-faced engine driver who seldom waved, because he had one hand on the regulator and the other on the air brake, with his eyes glued to the tracks ahead. The iron horse had to be kept under control. That magnanimous development of the industrial age drew the attention of all who witnessed it. Whether it was a streamlined, superheated compound joint of the English main lines, or the humble steamroller on a country road, the steam engine fascinated many and terrified a few. Every young lad born for over 100 years wanted to drive a steam engine, and when steam disappeared from the Irish rails in the 1950s, the railways lost a great part of their charm. Another part was lost when CTC, Central Train Control, took over from the mechanical signal cabins, with a row of levers controlling the signals and points, the point locks and shunting discs, with their block instruments and electric train staff and their coda bell rings. The signalmen had a lingo all of their own. They knew their rule book like a young lad was supposed to know his catechism, with a glossary of terms and expressions that are now all but obsolete and forgotten. But there was a time when life and limb depended on them, and a minor error could lead to a major disaster. It all ended for Attanagh Station in 1962. In the fall of that year, the government announced that a number of branch railway lines would be closed over the next few months. There was some shock and surprise when it was seen that the Portlaoise-Kilkenny line was included among them. This railway was always considered to be the main route from Dublin to Waterford and was in substantial use. Branch lines were supposed to be those railways that dead-ended at provincial towns. Despite some protests which lacked political backup, closure went ahead. The last passenger train operated on Monday the 31st of December 1962. It was the 5 p.m. Kingsbridge, now Houston to Waterford via Portlaoise, due in Attanagh at 6:44 p.m. The 24-hour clock was not in use then. It arrived in Attanagh approximately half an hour late, not because it was the last train, but because of the inclement weather conditions at the time. When the tail lamp of that train disappeared around the bend and its last rumble was smothered by the sour northeastern snot cutter that blew that winter's night, it was the end of a railway tradition that had grown for almost a century. It was unreal, unbelievable, that it was all over, just like that. Because the trains had worked their way into people's lives and had become part of them. The train not only had carved its way into the landscape, the tracks of its unique culture were also embedded into the psyche of those lucky enough to have lived through its existence. People who seldom if ever used the trains still took note of them. They had a song down in Kerry that started, "The dingle train is whistling now, 'tis time to wet the tail." The passing of a train assisted in mapping out the day. The train told people the time. Time to set their clocks or watches, time to get up, time for the meals, time to go for the cows, and long ago, time to light the lamp. But now, the last train had gone, and 'twas all over. Or was it? Someday, the Celtic Tiger will be back, won't he what? And there will be loads of money again. Money to lend, money to spend, and no doubt money to squander. It will not be outside the bounds of possibility that the Portlaoise-Kilkenny Railway will be relaid and reopened again, albeit with a modern train service. There are people there who tell us that in 30 to 50 years' time there will be no petrol, no diesel and no rubber. The world's supply of these commodities will be exhausted. So people who need to travel on land will be back on track or on Shanksmayor. And it would not be far-fetched to say that Attanagh Station will open once more, but with a vast difference. There will be a concrete platform and a yellow line on it, with an aluminium shelter and a ticket machine, and an automatic barrier crossing for the road. They won't be putting back the heavy black and white wooden level crossing gates that were locked from the signal cabin long ago, or the 2 red lamps that warned the road traffic at night when the gates were closed against it. Or they won't be putting back the white signal posts with the red and white semaphore signals that warned the trains. There will be no whistling engine with its excess steam roaring through the safety valve, frightening children and horses, and another old one as well. There will be no black-faced fireman with his cheery wave, or grim-faced driver with his eyes on the road ahead. None of these will be there, because they were part and parcel of the sort of railway that we knew in Attanagh over 50 years ago, a railway now well and truly gone forever. Thank you.
Has anybody any questions on the railway?
Was it round logs that were transported on the train from the local forests?
It would be, yes, it would be long, yes, they were.
Or were they brought here by horse and
Horse and
dray?
horse and dray, yeah.
So now, you're welcome to stay for a cup of tea, which is Alison and Patricia and Pádraig and a few more have very generously set up at the back. Before we do, I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Walter Phelan for providing us with a platform here in his wonderful venue. I'd like to thank our technical expert here, Daniel Dunn, without whom there'd be a few panic attacks done. Martin and Bredo Kelly for providing us with some of the railway photographs. Reverend Patrick Harvey, who sends his apologies for we can't be here. He often gives us information on the Church of Ireland. And of course, thank you all very much for attending. So I said you're welcome to a cup of tea. Okay.